They thought urine was an aphrodisiac. Not just any urine, mind you, but specifically the urine of a virgin, preferably collected at dawn on the feast day of a saint. The medieval physician would heat it in a copper pot, mix it with crushed pearls and the ground horn of a unicorn, which was actually narwhal tusk, and serve it to a nobleman who couldn't perform his husbandly duties. The smell alone should have been enough to cure any one of romantic inclinations permanently, but somehow this was considered the height of medical sophistication in the year 1347. Tonight we're diving into the murky, malodorous world of medieval sexuality, where hygiene was optional, consent was a foreign concept, and the church had opinions about everything you did in bed, including which positions would send you straight to hell. Before you get comfortable, drop a like and comment down below where you're listening in from and what time it is for you, but only if you enjoy what I do here. It's always amazing to hear where everyone is listening in from around the globe, so settle in, maybe light a candle that smells better than anything we'll be discussing tonight, and let's explore just how spectacularly wrong our ancestors got everything about human intimacy. If you think dating apps are bad now, imagine a world where your marriage was arranged by people who thought bathing was dangerous, where the groom might not see the bride's face until the wedding day, and where the primary concern wasn't compatibility but whether she could produce male heirs before dying in childbirth. Welcome to romance in the Dark Ages. The process of finding a mate in medieval times was less about love and more about livestock trading. Fathers would examine potential daughters-in-law the way modern people inspect used cars, checking teeth for rot, feeling hands for calluses that indicated good work ethic, and sometimes even requiring a physical examination by a midwife to ensure the girl was still intact and capable of bearing children. Courtship rituals were elaborate affairs that made absolutely no sense. A knight might spend months composing terrible poetry about a lady's eyebrows while never actually speaking to her directly. Instead, he would send messages through servants, gifts through intermediaries, and occasionally serenade her window at 3 in the morning, which was considered romantic rather than grounds for a restraining order. The concept of romantic love as we know it was largely invented by bored French nobles who had too much time on their hands. They created elaborate rules for courtly love that were so complicated they required instruction manuals. A proper lover was supposed to suffer beautifully, write anguished letters, and preferably waste away from unrequited passion. Actually consummating the relationship was considered rather gauche and definitely not romantic. Meanwhile, the common folk had more practical approaches to romance. A farmer might court a girl by showing her his best cow, or demonstrating his ability to lift heavy sacks of grain. Romantic gifts included useful items like a new wooden spoon, a length of cloth, or sometimes a freshly killed chicken. Nothing said "I love you" quite like poultry that was still warm. The church, never one to miss an opportunity to regulate human behavior, had extensive rules about courtship. Couples were forbidden from being alone together, required to have chaperones at all times, and absolutely could not touch except for brief hand-holding during betrothal ceremonies. This led to creative interpretations of acceptable contact, including elaborate foot-touching under tables, and the development of an entire secret language of fan movements and handkerchief signals. Betrothal contracts were more complex than modern corporate mergers. They specified dowries, inheritance rights, property transfers, and sometimes even included clauses about what would happen if the bride turned out to be a witch. The negotiation process could take months, during which the prospective couple continued to rarely speak to each other directly. The actual proposal was rarely a surprise, since marriages were typically arranged by families for economic or political advantage. However, there were still ceremonial aspects to observe. The groom was expected to formally ask the bride's father for permission, even if the deal had already been struck months earlier. This conversation usually took place in front of witnesses and involved a lot of discussion about sheep, land boundaries, and the bride's skill at managing household servants. Gift-giving during courtship followed specific rules that varied by social class. Nobles exchanged expensive items like jewelry, fine fabrics, or rare books. Merchants might trade in exotic spices or foreign coins. Peasants stuck to practical items, though even these had romantic significance. A well-crafted wooden bowl implied the giver was skilled with his hands. A length of good wool suggested he was prosperous enough to afford quality materials. The timing of courtship was also regulated by the church calendar. Couples could not become engaged during Lent, Advent, or numerous feast days throughout the year. This meant that certain seasons were particularly busy for matchmaking, leading to what we might now call engagement season, when families rushed to arrange marriages during the few acceptable windows in the religious calendar. Love potions were a thriving business, despite being officially condemned by the church. These concoctions typically contained bizarre ingredients like ground bat wings, menstrual blood, and various herbs that were more likely to cause stomach upset than romantic feelings. The belief in their effectiveness was so strong that people would pay enormous sums for recipes that mostly consisted of common garden plants mixed with wine. The wedding night in medieval times was less about romance and more about public performance art with very uncomfortable expectations. Before the couple could even think about privacy, they had to endure elaborate ceremonies designed to ensure the marriage was properly consummated and witnessed, though thankfully not in the way you might be imagining. The bedding ceremony was one of the most bizarre traditions of medieval wedding celebrations. After the feast, the entire wedding party would escort the bride and groom to their chamber, complete with musicians, ribald songs, and enough alcohol to make everyone forget how awkward this was. The bride would be undressed by the female wedding guests, while the groom was similarly attended to by the men. This wasn't considered invasive, it was considered helpful. Once the couple was in bed, usually wearing special white nightgowns that had been blessed by a priest, the witnesses would sprinkle holy water on the bed, say prayers, and then mercifully leave them alone. However, the pressure didn't end there. The couple was expected to produce blood-stained sheets the next morning as proof that the bride had been a virgin and the marriage had been properly consummated. The church had very specific rules about what was and wasn't acceptable in the marital bed. Certain positions were considered sinful, certain days of the week were off limits for marital relations, and the entire concept was supposed to be focused on procreation rather than pleasure. Enjoying yourself too much was considered a sin, which must have made for some very awkward and guilty-feeling honeymoons. Medieval medical texts contained detailed instructions for new husbands about how to approach their wives on the wedding night. These guides read like poorly written technical manuals and contained advice that was both hilariously wrong and deeply concerning. Physicians recommended that men approach their wives like a gentle physician approaching a fearful patient, which sounds romantic until you remember that medieval medicine involved leeches and drilling holes in people's heads. The bride's preparation for the wedding night was equally bizarre. She would be given special baths with herbs that were supposed to increase fertility, fed foods believed to enhance conception, and sometimes even given amulets to wear that were meant to ensure she would bear male children. The pressure to produce a son immediately was enormous, and failure to become pregnant quickly was often blamed entirely on the woman. Wedding night traditions varied significantly by social class. Noble families might have elaborate ceremonies with expensive linens, rare perfumes, and musicians playing outside the chamber. Peasant weddings were simpler affairs, but they still included the essential elements of public witnessing and mourning verification. Regardless of social status, the woman's virginity was considered a commodity that transferred ownership from father to husband. The concept of consent as we understand it today simply didn't exist. Women were expected to submit to their husband's desires without question, and refusal could be grounds for annulment or worse. This wasn't considered problematic. It was considered natural order. The idea that a woman might have her own desires or preferences about intimate matters was so foreign as to be almost incomprehensible. Special foods were believed to enhance performance on the wedding night. Grooms were fed oysters, eggs, and various spiced wines that were supposed to increase virility. Brides were given milk, honey, and herbs that were thought to make them more receptive and fertile. Most of these aphrodisiacs had no actual effect beyond making people feel sick from unusual combinations of food and alcohol. The bride's mother or a designated female relative would inspect the sheets for evidence of virginity and consummation. If the required blood was present, there would be celebrations, and the sheets might even be displayed as proof of the marriage's validity. If not, the consequences could range from social disgrace to annulment of the marriage. Privacy was a luxury that most couples couldn't afford. Many newlyweds lived with extended family members in small homes where the bedroom might be separated from the main living area by nothing more than a curtain. This meant that wedding nights often took place with parents, siblings, and sometimes servants sleeping just a few feet away. The concept of a romantic getaway was limited to the very wealthy. Medieval physicians had theories about human sexuality that were so wildly incorrect they make astrology look like hard science. They believed that sexual health was governed by the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that any problems in the bedroom could be solved by adjusting these invisible fluids through increasingly bizarre treatments. If a man was having performance issues, the recommended cure might involve bloodletting to remove excess heat, purging to eliminate corrupted humours, or applying leeches to areas that are best left unmentioned. Women experiencing any kind of sexual dysfunction were typically diagnosed with wandering womb, a condition where physicians believed the uterus literally moved around inside the body, causing various problems. The cure was to lure it back into place using strong-smelling substances applied to different parts of the body. The medical understanding of anatomy was roughly equivalent to a kindergartner's drawing of the human body. Physicians believed that women were essentially incomplete men, with internal rather than external reproductive organs. This led to treatments that attempted to complete women by applying heat to encourage their hidden male parts to emerge, which explains why so many medieval remedies involved uncomfortable amounts of warming oils and hot compressors. Fertility treatments were particularly creative in their wrongness. Couples struggling to conceive might be advised to eat specific combinations of foods during certain phases of the moon, wear particular gemstones in intimate places, or perform elaborate rituals that combined pagan fertility traditions with Christian prayers. One popular remedy involved the woman drinking wine that had been blessed by a priest and mixed with ground unicorn horn, which was expensive, disgusting, and completely ineffective. The timing of intimate relations was regulated not just by the church but by medical advice that was equally arbitrary. Physicians believed that conception was more likely during certain hours of the day, phases of the moon, and seasons of the year. They recommended avoiding marital relations during thunderstorms, eclipses, and various feast days, creating a complex calendar of when it was medically advisable to attempt procreation. Medieval contraception methods ranged from the merely ineffective to the actively dangerous. Popular techniques included wearing amulets made from specific stones, drinking herbal concoctions that were more likely to cause poisoning than prevent pregnancy, and inserting various substances that could cause serious infections. The church officially condemned all forms of contraception, but people still sought out these remedies, often from wise women who practiced medicine on the margins of society. Sexually transmitted diseases were poorly understood and often attributed to moral failings rather than medical causes. The treatments were typically worse than the diseases themselves, involving painful procedures, toxic substances, and religious rituals designed to cleanse the soul as well as the body. Mercury was a popular cure-all that probably killed more people than it helped, but physicians continued to prescribe it because they had no better alternatives. The concept of female pleasure was so foreign to medieval medicine that most physicians didn't believe it existed. Women were thought to be naturally passive and receptive, incapable of experiencing the same physical sensations as men. This led to medical advice that completely ignored female anatomy and pleasure, focusing entirely on male performance and reproductive outcomes. Aphrodisiacs were a major industry in medieval medicine, with physicians prescribing everything from ground rhinoceros horn to various animal organs that bore resemblance to human anatomy. These expensive and exotic ingredients were often imported from distant lands, making them costly status symbols as well as supposed medical treatments. The placebo effect probably accounted for any success these remedies achieved. Mental health issues related to sexuality were typically attributed to demonic possession or moral corruption rather than psychological causes. People suffering from what we might now recognize as sexual trauma, dysfunction, or orientation issues were subjected to exorcisms, purification rituals, and various forms of religious intervention that were more likely to increase suffering than provide relief. The training of medieval physicians in matters of sexuality was based entirely on ancient texts that had been copied and recopied for centuries, accumulating errors and misinterpretations along the way. Medical students learned from books rather than observation, leading to treatments based on theoretical humoral imbalances rather than actual understanding of human anatomy and physiology. The medieval Catholic Church had opinions about every aspect of human sexuality, and they weren't shy about sharing them. Church authorities produced detailed manuals that specified exactly when, how, and why married couples could engage in intimate relations, creating a bureaucracy of bedroom oversight that would make modern governments seem hands-off by comparison. The church calendar was riddled with days when marital relations were forbidden. These included all of Lent, Advent, Ember Days, various saints' feast days, Sundays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and sometimes Saturdays. By some calculations, there were only about 70 days per year when intimate relations were actually permitted, which must have made family planning extremely challenging. Position restrictions were elaborate and specific. The church approved exactly one position for marital relations. Anything else was considered sinful and could result in penance ranging from fasting to pilgrimage. Priests were trained to ask detailed questions during confession about couples' intimate practices, creating an uncomfortable level of clerical involvement in private matters. The concept of pleasure was deeply problematic for church authorities. They taught that any enjoyment of marital relations beyond what was necessary for procreation was sinful. This created impossible psychological burdens for couples who were supposed to fulfill their marital duties while simultaneously feeling guilty about any pleasure they might experience in the process. Penance manuals provided specific punishments for various sexual sins. These handbooks were bestsellers among medieval clergy and contained detailed descriptions of forbidden acts along with corresponding punishments. The punishments ranged from saying specific prayers to undertaking expensive pilgrimages, effectively creating a sin-based economy where wealthy people could afford to transgress more than the poor. The church's attitude toward women's sexuality was particularly harsh. Women were seen as naturally more lustful and dangerous than men, inheritors of Eve's sin who needed constant moral guidance to avoid leading men astray. This led to restrictions on women's clothing, behavior, and social interactions that were justified as protecting men from temptation. Clerical celibacy was supposed to set an example for proper sexual restraint, but the reality was often quite different. Many priests had unofficial wives called concubines and fathered children despite their vows. This hypocrisy was widely known but rarely addressed, creating a system where those enforcing sexual morality were often failing to follow their own rules. The sacrament of marriage was seen primarily as a remedy for lust rather than a celebration of love. Church teachings emphasized that marriage was a necessary evil, a way to channel dangerous sexual desires into socially acceptable procreation. The idea that married couples might enjoy each other's company or find spiritual connection through physical intimacy was largely absent from official doctrine. Confession became a mechanism for sexual surveillance, with priests trained to extract detailed information about parishioners' intimate lives. Confession manuals provided specific questions for priests to ask, creating standardized interrogations about sexual practices that violated any modern concept of privacy. People were required to confess their sexual sins regularly or face eternal damnation. The church's influence extended beyond official doctrine to popular culture and social attitudes. Sermons regularly featured warnings about sexual sin, religious art depicted the consequences of lust in graphic detail, and religious festivals often included morality plays that reinforced messages about sexual restraint and proper behavior. Marriage annulment was possible but extremely difficult to obtain, requiring extensive church bureaucracy and often substantial financial payments. The grounds for annulment were limited and specific, usually involving claims of non-consummation, prior marriage, or close blood relationship. This meant that most unhappy couples were trapped in their marriages regardless of circumstances. Personal cleanliness in medieval times was not just poor by modern standards, it was actively discouraged by medical and religious authorities who believed that bathing was dangerous to both physical and spiritual health. This created intimate situations that were, to put it mildly, extremely unpleasant for everyone involved. The typical medieval person bathed perhaps once or twice per year, usually before major religious holidays. The rest of the time, they relied on changing their linen undergarments occasionally and using strong perfumes to mask odors. When people did bathe, they often shared the same bathwater with multiple family members, making the exercise somewhat counterproductive from a hygiene standpoint. Teeth cleaning was virtually non-existent for most of the population. People might occasionally chew herbs or scrape their teeth with twigs, but dental hygiene as we understand it simply didn't exist. This meant that intimate conversations involved breath that could probably strip paint, and kissing was an act of true devotion or complete olfactory shutdown. The understanding of how diseases spread was so poor that people often shared beds, clothing, and personal items without any awareness that they might be transmitting infections. Sexually transmitted diseases were rampant and poorly understood, leading to treatments that were often worse than the diseases themselves, and rarely addressing the actual causes. Laundry was an enormous undertaking that happened infrequently, meaning that people wore the same clothes for weeks or months at a time. Undergarments were considered luxury items that many people couldn't afford, so they wore the same outer garments directly against their skin day after day. The buildup of sweat, dirt, and other bodily secretions created a personal environment that was actively hostile to romantic encounters. Women's menstrual hygiene was particularly challenging in an era without manufactured sanitary products. They relied on rags that were washed irregularly and often shared among family members. The social taboos around menstruation meant that women were expected to continue their normal activities while managing this biological function with completely inadequate tools and support. Hair care was limited to occasional washing with harsh soaps that often damaged both hair and scalp. Most people had constant issues with lice and other parasites, leading to frequent scratching and head shaving. The romantic ideal of long, flowing hair was mostly limited to artistic depictions rather than reality, where hair was more likely to be greasy, tangled, and infested with insects. Body odor wasn't just accepted, it was often considered a sign of honest work and moral character. The aristocracy might mask their smell with expensive perfumes and oils, but they still rarely bathed and often had their own unique aromatic signatures that their intimates would have to become accustomed to. The idea that cleanliness might be attractive or healthy was largely foreign to medieval thinking. Skin conditions were common and poorly treated, leading to widespread issues with rashes, infections, and various dermatological problems that made physical contact uncomfortable or even painful. People learned to ignore or work around these issues because they had no effective treatments and no concept that many of these problems were preventable through better hygiene. The lack of understanding about germs and disease transmission meant that people engaged in practices that actively spread infections. Sharing drinking vessels, eating utensils, and sleeping arrangements was common, creating ideal conditions for various diseases to spread throughout communities. Intimate relationships were particularly vulnerable to this kind of transmission. Public facilities for hygiene were limited and often more dangerous than helpful. Public bathhouses, where they existed, were often centers of disease transmission rather than cleanliness. The water was rarely changed. Multiple people used the same facilities simultaneously, and the conditions were generally unsanitary by any objective standard. The medieval marriage system was essentially a sophisticated form of human trafficking, disguised as social custom. Young women were bought and sold through dowry systems that treated them as economic assets rather than human beings with their own desires and agency. The younger the bride, the higher her value in this marketplace of human misery. Arranged marriages typically involved girls as young as 12 being promised to men they had never met, often decades older than themselves. These arrangements were negotiated entirely between male relatives, with the bride having no say in the decision that would determine the rest of her life. The wedding night for these child brides was essentially legalized sexual assault, sanctioned by both church and state. The dowry system created perverse incentives that encouraged families to view daughters as financial burdens who needed to be disposed of as quickly and cheaply as possible. Fathers would go into debt to provide adequate dowries, leading to situations where families sold land, livestock, or even other children to fund marriages for their daughters. The pressure to marry off daughters young was enormous and led to increasingly younger brides being offered to secure better dowry terms. Marriage contracts were more detailed than modern business agreements, specifying not just financial arrangements but also intimate obligations, inheritance rights, and behavioral expectations. These documents treated women as property to be transferred from father to husband, with specific clauses about what would happen if the wife proved defective in various ways. The practice of wife selling was legal in many parts of medieval Europe, allowing husbands to literally auction off their wives to other men if the marriage proved unsatisfactory. These transactions were conducted in public markets alongside livestock sales, with the wife often led to the auction block with a rope around her neck like a farm animal. International marriage trading involved families sending daughters to foreign countries as part of political alliances, often to men who spoke different languages and practiced different customs. These young women would be completely isolated from their families and support systems, trapped in marriages with no possibility of return or escape. The age gap between medieval spouses was often shocking by modern standards. It was common for men in their 40s or 50s to marry girls barely into puberty, creating relationships that were fundamentally based on power imbalance and exploitation. These marriages were seen as normal and beneficial, providing financial security for the girl's family and a young fertile wife for the older man. Remarriage after death of a spouse was often arranged before the mourning period had even ended, particularly for wealthy widows who controlled valuable property. These women might find themselves married to their late husband's relatives or business partners within weeks of being widowed, regardless of their own wishes or feelings about the arrangement. The Church's role in legitimizing this system was crucial to its operation. Religious authorities provided moral justification for child marriage, spousal abuse, and the treatment of women as property by citing biblical passages and theological arguments that supported male dominance and female submission. Escape from these marriages was virtually impossible. Annulment required church approval and was usually only granted for technical reasons like consanguinity or prior marriage. Divorce was not an option for most people, leaving women trapped in abusive or incompatible marriages with no legal recourse or social support for leaving. The economic incentives of the marriage system meant that families often had multiple daughters to dispose of, and limited resources to provide adequate dowries for all of them. This led to situations where some daughters would be married off very young to secure the best possible matches, while others might be sent to convents or simply abandoned if the family couldn't afford to support them. The medieval period contained bizarre contradictions in religious attitudes towards sexuality, including practices that modern people would find impossible to reconcile with Christian theology. Some religious communities practiced forms of sacred sexuality that were officially condemned but unofficially tolerated, creating a complex underground world of religious sexual expression. Certain mystical traditions encouraged forms of spiritual ecstasy that were explicitly sexual in nature, with religious texts describing union with the divine in terms that were indistinguishable from erotic literature. These practices were usually restricted to enclosed religious communities, where they could be hidden from broader church oversight and public scandal. The cult of courtly love that developed in medieval France had religious overtones that bordered on heretical, with lovers worshipping their beloveds in language typically reserved for saints, and adopting practices that resembled religious devotion more than romantic attachment. This created a parallel religious system based on erotic desire that competed with official church teachings. Some pilgrimage sites developed reputations as places where sexual behavior that would normally be forbidden was temporarily permitted or overlooked. These locations attracted visitors who combined religious devotion with sexual adventure, creating a form of religious tourism that the church found difficult to control or suppress. Certain feast days and religious festivals included traditions that involved sexual license, temporary marriages, and ritual fertility practices that dated back to pre-Christian times but had been incorporated into Christian celebrations. These events created annual opportunities for sexual behavior that would be condemned during the rest of the year. The veneration of certain saints included practices that were explicitly sexual in nature, with pilgrims seeking fertility blessings, sexual healing, and romantic success through rituals that involved intimate contact with religious relics and images. The line between religious devotion and sexual practice became completely blurred in these contexts. Some monastic communities developed elaborate theological justifications for sexual practices that were technically forbidden by their vows. These arguments often involved complex interpretations of scripture and church doctrine that allowed for forms of physical intimacy while maintaining technical celibacy through semantic loopholes. The practice of religious flagellation often took on sexual overtones, with participants achieving states of ecstasy through pain that were described in explicitly erotic terms. These practices attracted participants who were seeking spiritual experiences through physical sensation in ways that clearly crossed the boundaries between religious and sexual activity. Certain heretical sects practiced forms of Christianity that included sexual rituals as part of their religious observance, believing that physical union was a form of spiritual communion. These groups were heavily persecuted by Orthodox Church authorities, but continued to operate in secret throughout the medieval period. The phenomenon of incubae and succubi reflected medieval beliefs about demonic sexuality that allowed people to discuss and explore sexual fantasies within a religious framework. These supposedly supernatural encounters provided a way to acknowledge sexual desires while maintaining religious respectability through claims of demonic influence. Religious art from the medieval period often contained sexual imagery that was justified through theological symbolism, but clearly served other purposes as well. Churches and monasteries were filled with carvings, paintings, and manuscripts that depicted sexual acts in detail under the guise of religious instruction or moral warning. The sexual practices of medieval nobility were constrained by neither morality nor common sense, leading to a culture of aristocratic depravity that would make modern celebrity scandals seem quaint by comparison. Wealthy nobles had the resources to indulge their worst impulses and the political power to avoid consequences for their actions. Royal courts were essentially ongoing orgies disguised as political gatherings, with noble families bringing their most attractive relatives to court in hopes of gaining favor through sexual alliances. These arrangements often involved very young family members being offered to much older nobles as part of complex political negotiations that treated human sexuality as a form of currency. The practice of droit du seigneur, or the lord's right to sleep with brides on their wedding night, was more than just feudal legend. Many nobles claimed this privilege and exercised it regularly, creating a system where peasant women had no protection from sexual exploitation by their social superiors. These encounters were considered legal and normal rather than assault. Noble households often included elaborate networks of concubines, mistresses, and sexual servants who were maintained alongside official wives and families. These arrangements were known to everyone involved but rarely acknowledged openly, creating complex social hierarchies based on sexual access and favor that determined everything from living arrangements to inheritance rights. The education of young nobles often included explicit sexual instruction that would be considered inappropriate child abuse by modern standards. Boys and girls from aristocratic families were taught about sexuality through hands-on experience with adult servants and tutors, creating a system of institutionalized sexual exploitation that was considered normal preparation for adult life. Intermarriage among noble families reached levels that created widespread genetic problems, but the sexual and political advantages of keeping wealth and power within small circles of related families outweighed any concerns about the health consequences of this inbreeding. The results were often visible in the physical and mental abnormalities that became common among aristocratic bloodlines. Some noble families developed reputations for particularly extreme sexual practices that went far beyond the normal excesses of their class. These behaviors were often overlooked or excused because of the family's political importance, creating a system where wealth and power provided immunity from both legal consequences and social condemnation. The tournaments and festivals that occupied much of noble social life were often pretexts for elaborate sexual competitions and exchanges. These events brought together nobles from different regions who would engage in various forms of sexual diplomacy, using intimate relationships to forge political alliances and gain advantages in ongoing feudal conflicts. Noble women often found themselves trapped in impossible situations where they were expected to maintain their virtue, while also using their sexuality to advance their family's political interests. This created a culture of aristocratic women who became expert at navigating complex sexual politics while maintaining the appearance of moral propriety. The hunting parties and military campaigns that took nobles away from their home territories for extended periods often became opportunities for sexual behavior that would be impossible under normal social oversight. These expeditions created temporary communities where normal rules were suspended, and participants engaged in activities that would create scandals if they occurred at home. The patronage system that supported medieval artists, musicians, and writers often included sexual services as part of the compensation package. Noble patrons expected access to the attractive young people in their employ, creating a system where artistic talent was often secondary to sexual availability in determining career success. Life in medieval villages created sexual practices that were shaped more by practical necessity than moral idealism, leading to behaviors that would shock both contemporary nobles and modern observers. The harsh realities of rural poverty, seasonal labor demands, and constant survival struggles created a sexual culture that was pragmatic, communal, and often desperate. Agricultural cycles determined not just work patterns but also sexual and reproductive timing, with conception and childbirth planned around planting and harvest seasons to maximize survival chances for both mothers and infants. This created rigid seasonal patterns of sexual activity that were dictated by economic necessity rather than personal desire. The physical intimacy required by medieval agricultural work meant that young people worked closely together in ways that created numerous opportunities for sexual encounter. Shared labor in fields, barns, and workshops brought unmarried men and women into close physical contact that would be considered inappropriate in more formal social settings. Rural housing arrangements meant that multiple families often shared single rooms or buildings, creating living situations where privacy was impossible and sexual activity occurred within earshot and sometimes sight of children, elderly relatives, and unrelated neighbors. This communal approach to sexuality created very different attitudes about modesty and appropriate behavior. The seasonal nature of agricultural work created periods of intense social interaction, alternating with times of relative isolation, leading to concentrated periods of courtship and sexual activity during festivals, market days, and religious celebrations, when people from different villages would gather together. Economic pressures meant that rural families often had to make decisions about sexuality and reproduction based on their ability to support children rather than personal desires. This led to practices like delayed marriage, widespread use of crude contraception methods, and sometimes infanticide when families couldn't support additional mouths to feed. The absence of formal law enforcement in rural areas meant that sexual behavior was regulated primarily through community social pressure and religious guidance, creating local customs and practices that might vary significantly from village to village, and often conflicted with official church teaching or noble expectations. Seasonal workers and traveling laborers created a mobile population that brought different sexual practices and diseases to rural communities, while also providing opportunities for sexual encounters outside the normal social constraints of village life. These temporary relationships often resulted in children whose paternity was uncertain and whose care became community responsibilities. The harsh physical demands of agricultural life meant that people aged quickly and had relatively short periods of peak fertility and sexual activity, leading to compressed timelines for courtship, marriage, and reproduction that created intense pressure to find suitable partners and begin families while still physically capable. Rural attitudes towards sexuality were often more pragmatic and less moralistic than those found in urban or noble settings, with communities accepting various forms of sexual arrangement that helped ensure survival and mutual support, even if they conflicted with official religious or legal standards. The isolation of rural communities meant that genetic diversity was limited and intermarriage among related families was common, leading to higher rates of birth defects and genetic problems that were accepted as normal parts of rural life rather than preventable medical issues. Medieval cities developed sexual cultures that were both more sophisticated and more depraved than their rural counterparts, creating urban environments where commercial sex, exotic practices, and international influences combined to produce unprecedented levels of sexual complexity and exploitation. The concentration of wealth in medieval cities created a class of merchants and professionals who had both the money and the leisure time to indulge in sexual practices that were impossible in rural settings. This urban elite developed tastes for exotic sexual experiences that drove markets for everything from imported aphrodisiacs to specialized sexual services. Commercial prostitution in medieval cities was often legal and regulated, creating official red light districts where sexual services were bought and sold under government oversight. These areas developed their own cultures, economies, and social hierarchies that operated parallel to, but separate from mainstream urban society. The presence of foreign merchants, diplomats, and travelers in medieval cities brought together people from different cultures with varying sexual practices and expectations, creating environments where sexual experimentation and cultural exchange occurred alongside commercial and political activities. Urban craftsmen and merchants often lived in close quarters with their employees and apprentices, creating household arrangements where sexual relationships between masters and servants were common and often economically motivated. These relationships were rarely based on equality or mutual consent, but rather on economic dependency and power imbalances. The greater anonymity possible in large cities allowed for sexual practices that would be impossible in small rural communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. This urban anonymity enabled everything from extramarital affairs to participation in sexual subcultures that operated in secret. Medieval cities attracted people fleeing rural poverty, family obligations, or sexual scandals, creating urban populations that included many individuals with complex sexual histories and non-conforming gender expressions who found refuge in the relative tolerance and anonymity of city life. The seasonal influx of rural workers during harvest time and religious pilgrims during festival periods created periodic population surges that strained urban resources while also creating temporary markets for sexual services and opportunities for sexual encounters between urban and rural populations. Urban medical practitioners often specialized in sexual health issues and fertility treatments, developing more sophisticated approaches to sexual medicine than were available in rural areas. However, these treatments were often expensive and available only to wealthy urban residents, creating healthcare disparities that affected sexual health outcomes. The complexity of urban economic relationships meant that sexual arrangements often involved multiple parties and complex financial considerations, with marriages and other sexual relationships serving as vehicles for business partnerships, property transfers, and social advancement that went far beyond simple romantic attachment. The concentration of religious institutions in medieval cities created environments where official sexual morality was most strictly enforced, while also providing cover for various forms of sexual transgression among the clergy and religious communities that were supposed to be modeling proper behavior. Behind the walls of medieval monasteries and convents, sexual behavior often contradicted the celibate ideals that these institutions were supposed to represent, creating a culture of religious hypocrisy that extended from local abbeys to the highest levels of church hierarchy. Many monasteries were essentially elite social clubs for younger sons of noble families who had no intention of living celibate lives, but needed the economic security and social status that religious positions provided. These men often maintained mistresses, fathered children, and engaged in sexual practices that were completely incompatible with their religious vows. Female religious communities were particularly vulnerable to sexual exploitation by male clergy, who used their religious authority to coerce intimate relationships with nuns who had few options for resistance or escape. These relationships were often presented as spiritual guidance or religious obligation, making them particularly psychologically damaging. The practice of mixed-gender religious communities created opportunities for sexual relationships that were officially forbidden but practically inevitable when unmarried men and women lived in close proximity, under minimal supervision. Many of these communities eventually had to be separated by gender or disbanded entirely due to sexual scandals. Pilgrimage routes often included stops at monasteries and convents that developed reputations as places where sexual services were available alongside spiritual guidance. Traveling pilgrims could purchase both religious indulgences and sexual favors from the same religious communities, creating a form of holy prostitution that combined spiritual and carnal commerce. The economic pressures on religious communities often led to arrangements where wealthy patrons provided financial support in exchange for sexual access to attractive young monks or nuns. These relationships were disguised as spiritual mentorship or religious devotion, but they were essentially sophisticated forms of prostitution operating under religious cover. Confession became a tool for sexual exploitation, with priests using the confessional to extract detailed sexual information from parishioners and then using this knowledge to coerce intimate relationships. The secrecy of confession provided perfect cover for this abuse, as victims could not report what happened without violating religious obligations. Some religious communities developed elaborate theological justifications for sexual practices that clearly violated their vows of celibacy. These arguments often involved complex interpretations of scripture that allowed for physical intimacy while maintaining technical compliance with religious law. Through creative definitions of what constituted sexual activity, the sale of religious positions meant that many clergy purchased their roles rather than being called to religious service, leading to monasteries and convents filled with people who had no genuine religious vocation, but were using religious institutions as cover for various forms of sexual and economic exploitation. Certain feast days and religious celebrations became opportunities for sexual license within religious communities, with traditions that temporarily suspended normal rules about celibacy and allowed for behavior that would be strictly forbidden during the rest of the year. These events often involved alcohol, dancing, and intimate contact that contradicted everything these institutions claimed to represent. The practice of religious flagellation and other forms of physical penance often took on sexual overtones, with participants achieving states of ecstasy through pain that were clearly erotic in nature. These practices attracted people who were seeking sexual gratification through religious activities while maintaining the pretense of spiritual devotion. Some monastic communities became centers for the production of erotic literature and art, with monks and nuns creating sexually explicit materials that were distributed throughout medieval Europe under the guise of moral instruction or religious allegory. These works often contained detailed descriptions of sexual practices that the creators were supposedly forbidden from experiencing themselves. The phenomenon of spiritual marriage allowed some clergy to maintain intimate relationships while technically preserving their celibacy through complex theological arguments about the nature of spiritual versus physical union. These arrangements were often indistinguishable from actual marriage, except for the lack of official recognition. International religious orders created networks that facilitated the movement of sexually problematic clergy from one location to another when scandals became too difficult to cover up locally. This system allowed predatory religious figures to continue their activities in new communities where their histories were unknown. The education of young people in religious institutions often included forms of sexual instruction and experimentation that were justified as preparation for either celibate religious life or eventual marriage, but which created opportunities for abuse that were systematically covered up by religious authorities who prioritized institutional reputation over individual safety. Medieval marriage law was a Byzantine system of regulations that trapped people in relationships while simultaneously making it nearly impossible to establish legitimate unions, creating a legal framework that seemed designed to maximize human misery rather than promote social stability or personal happiness. The impediments to marriage were so numerous and complex that most couples were technically living in sin, according to church law, even when they believed themselves to be properly married. Relationships were forbidden between people related within 7 degrees of kinship, which in small medieval communities meant that almost everyone was potentially too closely related to marry anyone else they might actually know. The requirement for parental consent meant that many young adults were trapped in unwanted marriages arranged by their families while being unable to marry the people they actually loved. This system created widespread adultery and sexual frustration as people tried to find happiness outside marriages that had been forced upon them for economic or political reasons. The complexity of marriage law meant that wealthy people could often find legal grounds to annul marriages that had become inconvenient, while poor people were trapped in relationships regardless of how abusive or dysfunctional they might be. Justice in marriage law was directly proportional to one's ability to pay church lawyers and navigate ecclesiastical bureaucracy. Consanguinity rules were applied selectively and often retrospectively, meaning that marriages could be declared invalid years after they had been celebrated if it became politically or economically advantageous to do so. Children from these retroactively annulled marriages often found themselves declared illegitimate and stripped of inheritance rights. The requirement for witnesses to marriage ceremonies created opportunities for fraud and coercion, as unscrupulous individuals could arrange for false witnesses to either validate illegitimate marriages or invalidate legitimate ones depending on their purposes. The Church's reliance on witness testimony made the entire marriage system vulnerable to manipulation by people with resources and connections. Clandestine marriages were both forbidden and legally valid, creating an impossible contradiction, where couples could be both legitimately married and subject to punishment for the manner of their marriage. This led to widespread confusion about which relationships were actually valid and which were sinful or illegal. The doctrine of spiritual affinity meant that people who served as godparents to the same child became unable to marry each other or anyone in each other's families, creating complex webs of spiritual relationships that further limited marriage options in small communities where the same people served as godparents repeatedly. Property rights in marriage were so complex that many couples found themselves unable to make basic economic decisions without extensive legal consultation, as the transfer of property through marriage involved multiple jurisdictions, inheritance laws, and religious regulations that often contradicted each other. The age requirements for marriage varied by jurisdiction and were often ignored when economically advantageous, leading to situations where very young children found themselves in marriage contracts that they couldn't understand or escape. These child marriages were legally binding, even when the participants were too young to comprehend the nature of the agreements they were entering. Divorce was theoretically impossible for most people, but annulment procedures were so complex and expensive that they were effectively available only to the wealthy and politically connected. This created a system where marriage was permanent for poor people, but temporary for rich people, contradicting the supposed universality of church teaching about the sanctity of marriage. The requirement for ecclesiastical approval of marriages meant that couples often had to wait months or years for permission to marry while living in sin, according to the same church authorities who were delaying their weddings. This created impossible moral situations, where people were condemned for behavior that was caused by the church's own bureaucratic inefficiency. Medieval understanding of sexually transmitted diseases was so poor that most people attributed these conditions to everything except their actual causes, leading to treatments and social responses that were often worse than the diseases themselves while doing nothing to prevent their spread. The appearance of syphilis in Europe during the late medieval period created panic and confusion, as physicians had no framework for understanding a disease that was clearly sexual in transmission, but didn't fit their existing medical theories. The early symptoms were often attributed to bad air, corrupted blood, or divine punishment rather than sexual contact. Different countries blamed different nationalities for the spread of venereal diseases, with the French calling syphilis the Italian disease, the Italians calling it the French disease, and everyone generally agreeing that it must have come from somewhere else rather than acknowledging the role of local sexual practices in its transmission. Treatment for sexually transmitted diseases typically involved mercury, which was toxic enough to cause symptoms that were often worse than the original disease. Patients undergoing mercury treatment suffered from severe salivation, tooth loss, and neurological damage, leading to the medical saying that a night with Venus meant a lifetime with Mercury. The moral stigma attached to venereal diseases meant that many people refused to seek treatment or acknowledge their symptoms, leading to widespread untreated infections that caused severe health complications and continued transmission to sexual partners, and in the case of pregnant women, to their children. Some physicians believed that sexually transmitted diseases could be cured by having sex with a virgin, leading to a practice that victimized young girls while doing nothing to treat the actual diseases. This belief was so widespread that it created markets for virginity and contributed to child sexual abuse throughout medieval Europe. The lack of understanding about disease transmission meant that people with venereal diseases often continued their normal sexual activities while seeking magical or religious cures that had no medical effectiveness. This ensured that diseases continued to spread while communities wasted resources on ineffective treatments. Public bathhouses, which were already centers of disease transmission due to poor sanitation, became particular hotbeds for the spread of sexually transmitted infections, as people with active symptoms continued to use these facilities while believing that hot water might cure their conditions. The social consequences of visible venereal disease symptoms often included exile from communities, loss of employment, and family abandonment, creating populations of diseased outcasts who formed their own communities, where infections spread rapidly among people who had nowhere else to go. Military campaigns were particularly effective at spreading sexually transmitted diseases, as armies moved from region to region, engaging in sexual contact with local populations before moving on to spread their infections to new communities. Wars became inadvertent disease distribution networks that carried infections across vast geographic areas. The practice of medieval medicine meant that the same instruments were often used to treat multiple patients without any cleaning or sterilization, creating additional opportunities for disease transmission through medical procedures that were supposed to be healing rather than harmful. Religious responses to sexually transmitted diseases typically focused on moral purification rather than medical treatment, leading to practices like public confession of sexual sins, pilgrimage to holy sites, and prayer rather than any interventions that might actually address the underlying infections. The commercial sex trade in medieval Europe operated as a complex economic system that involved everything from street-level prostitution to international trafficking networks, creating markets in human sexuality that paralleled and sometimes exceeded legitimate commerce in their scope and sophistication. Urban brothels were often owned by wealthy merchants or nobles who treated them as investment properties, with careful attention to profit margins, customer satisfaction, and market positioning. These establishments competed with each other for clients by offering specialized services, attractive facilities, and marketing strategies that would be familiar to modern business operators. The taxation of prostitution provided significant revenue for medieval municipalities, with governments charging licensing fees, property taxes, and transaction fees on commercial sexual services. This official involvement in the sex trade created bureaucratic systems for regulating prostitution that treated it as a legitimate industry rather than a moral problem. International trade routes facilitated the movement of people for sexual purposes, with merchants and travelers participating in networks that transported attractive young people from poor regions to wealthy urban markets where they could be sold for sexual services. These trafficking operations were often indistinguishable from legitimate commercial activities. The pricing of sexual services reflected complex market factors, including the age, appearance, and supposed virginity of the providers, with detailed pricing structures that varied by geographic location, customer social status, and specific sexual acts requested. These price lists were sometimes recorded in official documents, creating historical records of sexual commerce. Seasonal fluctuations in the sex trade corresponded to agricultural cycles, religious festivals, and military campaigns, with periods of high demand, creating temporary markets for sexual services that drew providers from surrounding rural areas into urban centers where they could command higher prices for their services. The financing of commercial sex operations often involved complex arrangements with multiple investors, creating business partnerships that treated human sexuality as a commodity to be bought, sold, and traded like any other commercial product. These arrangements included profit-sharing agreements, territorial divisions, and competitive strategies. Credit systems allowed customers to purchase sexual services on account, creating debt relationships that sometimes led to customers becoming financially bound to particular establishments or providers. These credit arrangements were enforced through the same legal mechanisms used for other commercial debts. The insurance industry even extended to commercial sex operations, with policies that covered property damage, theft, and sometimes even the death or disability of valuable sexual service providers. These insurance arrangements treated human beings as business assets whose loss represented calculable financial damage. Currency exchange in international markets sometimes involved sexual services as a form of payment or trade good, with providers being used to settle debts, secure business agreements, or establish commercial relationships in the same way that other valuable commodities might be exchanged. The regulation of sexual commerce created opportunities for corruption among government officials who accepted bribes to overlook violations of prostitution laws or to provide preferential treatment to particular establishments. This corruption became so systematic that it was essentially an additional tax on the industry. Retirement planning for people involved in commercial sex work was virtually non-existent, as most providers had no legal protections, savings opportunities, or alternative career options once they were no longer young or attractive enough to command market rates for their services. This created populations of destitute former sex workers who became burdens on their communities. Medieval obstetrics and gynecology were practiced by people who had virtually no understanding of female anatomy or reproductive physiology, leading to treatments and procedures that were often more dangerous than the conditions they were supposed to address. Pregnancy was viewed with suspicion and fear rather than celebration, as maternal mortality rates were extraordinarily high and pregnancy complications were attributed to everything from moral failings to supernatural influences rather than medical causes that might be preventable or treatable. Labor and delivery took place in environments that were actively hostile to maternal and infant survival, with unsterilized instruments, unwashed hands, and birthing chambers that were breeding grounds for infections. The people attending births had no understanding of basic hygiene principles that might have prevented many deaths. Pain relief during childbirth was considered morally problematic by church authorities who believed that women were supposed to suffer during labor as punishment for Eve's sin. This meant that women endured excruciating pain without any medical intervention that might have made the experience more bearable or less dangerous. Caesarean sections were performed only on dead or dying mothers in desperate attempts to save their babies, as the surgical techniques and post-operative care necessary for maternal survival simply didn't exist. Women who underwent this procedure were essentially sacrificed to give their children a chance at life. Postpartum care was minimal and often counterproductive, with new mothers being subjected to treatments like bloodletting and purging that weakened them when they most needed to recover their strength. The lack of understanding about postpartum infections meant that many women died days or weeks after successful deliveries. Contraception methods were dangerous and ineffective, involving everything from toxic herbal preparations to physical devices that often caused serious injuries or infections. Women who sought to prevent pregnancy risked their health and sometimes their lives using methods that rarely worked and often caused additional problems. Miscarriage and stillbirth were common occurrences that were typically attributed to supernatural causes rather than medical factors, leading to treatments that focused on spiritual purification rather than addressing underlying health issues that might have prevented pregnancy losses. Gynecological examinations were conducted by male physicians who had never seen female anatomy and based their procedures on ancient texts that were often completely wrong about basic anatomical facts. These examinations were often more traumatic and dangerous than helpful for diagnosing or treating medical problems. The treatment of sexually transmitted diseases in women was particularly brutal, involving procedures like vaginal fumigation with toxic substances, insertion of caustic materials, and surgical interventions that were performed without anesthesia or proper instruments. Many women died from these treatments rather than from their original conditions. Menstrual disorders were attributed to spiritual or moral problems rather than physiological causes, leading to treatments that involved exorcism, bloodletting, and other procedures that had no medical basis but often caused additional health problems for women who were already suffering. The social isolation of women during menstruation and childbirth meant that they were often left without adequate food, warmth, or medical attention during times when they were most vulnerable to health complications. This isolation was justified by religious beliefs about female impurity, but resulted in preventable deaths and suffering. The sexual practices of medieval people sometimes went far beyond what might be considered normal by any historical standard, venturing into territories of behavior that seem to have been motivated more by desperation, mental illness, or complete moral breakdown than by any recognizable human desire. Necrophilia was more common than historical records typically acknowledge, facilitated by poor burial practices, frequent exposure to dead bodies during plagues and wars, and social conditions that left some people so isolated from normal human contact that they turned to the dead for companionship. These practices were usually discovered only by accident and rarely prosecuted effectively. Bestiality was widespread in rural communities where people lived in close contact with livestock and had limited opportunities for human sexual contact. The isolation of agricultural life, combined with the constant presence of domestic animals, created situations where these relationships developed and sometimes continued for years without detection or intervention. Self-mutilation for sexual purposes occurred among people who were either seeking to enhance their sexual experiences through pain or trying to eliminate their sexual desires entirely through physical damage. These practices ranged from relatively minor modifications to severe injuries that caused permanent disability or death. Group sexual activities were sometimes organized around religious festivals or seasonal celebrations, creating community events where normal social restrictions were temporarily suspended, and entire villages might engage in collective sexual behavior that would be forbidden during the rest of the year. Sexual relationships between adults and children were far more common and socially accepted than modern people would find imaginable, with apprenticeship systems, household service arrangements, and educational institutions creating numerous opportunities for exploitation that were considered normal parts of growing up rather than abuse. The use of objects and substances for sexual purposes often involved materials that were dangerous or toxic, as people experimented with everything from plant and animal products to various chemicals and mechanical devices without any understanding of their potential health consequences. Sexual violence was so normalized in medieval society that many practices that would be considered clear assault by modern standards were seen as acceptable expressions of male dominance or legitimate punishment for various social transgressions by women who had somehow violated community expectations. Ritual sexual practices associated with pagan traditions continued in secret throughout the medieval period, often involving group ceremonies, symbolic acts, and behaviors that combined sexual activity with magical or religious beliefs that predated Christianity but never completely disappeared from popular culture. The sexual exploitation of people with mental disabilities was widespread and rarely recognized as problematic, with individuals who couldn't understand or consent to sexual activity being used for the gratification of others who faced no social or legal consequences for this behavior. Some communities developed sexual practices that were specific to their geographic locations or cultural backgrounds, creating regional variations in sexual behavior that reflected local traditions, resource availability, and social structures, but often involved activities that would be considered extreme or abnormal by broader medieval standards. Extreme age disparities in sexual relationships were common and socially acceptable, with arrangements that paired very elderly people with children or young adults, creating relationships that were inherently exploitative but were justified through economic necessity, family arrangements, or social conventions that prioritized practical considerations over individual welfare. Sexual relationships that involved deliberate transmission of diseases were sometimes motivated by revenge, mental illness, or beliefs about the spiritual or magical properties of various conditions, leading to intentional infection practices that spread diseases throughout communities while satisfying individual psychological needs or social grudges. The intersection of death and sexuality in medieval life created particularly disturbing patterns of behavior that reflected the brutal realities of a society where human life had little value and sexual violence was considered a normal part of social interaction. Rape during military campaigns was not just tolerated, but actively encouraged as a reward for soldiers and a weapon of war against enemy populations. These mass sexual assaults were planned military strategies that were designed to demoralize communities, assert dominance, and provide incentives for military service. The sexual abuse of condemned prisoners was a standard part of many execution procedures, with victims being subjected to various forms of sexual torture and humiliation before their deaths. These practices were sometimes justified as additional punishment for their crimes, but were more often simply expressions of sadistic cruelty. Executions themselves often took on sexual overtones, with public hangings and other forms of capital punishment becoming opportunities for sexual display and voyeuristic gratification. The crowds that gathered to watch executions sometimes engaged in sexual activity during the proceedings, treating death as entertainment and sexual stimulation. The treatment of suspected witches involved sexual torture and examination that was designed to humiliate and degrade as much as to extract confessions. These procedures included intimate physical examinations, sexual assault with various instruments, and public exposure that was justified as necessary for detecting supernatural influences. Sexual relationships with dying people were sometimes motivated by beliefs about the transfer of life force, supernatural powers, or spiritual benefits that could be gained through intimate contact with individuals who were near death. These practices combined magical thinking with sexual exploitation of vulnerable people. Grave robbing for sexual purposes occurred when people sought access to recently buried bodies for necrophilic activities. The poor burial practices and shallow graves common in medieval times made these activities relatively easy and difficult to detect, leading to widespread desecration of burial sites. The sexual exploitation of orphans and other vulnerable children was facilitated by social systems that provided no protection for people who had no family connections or social status. These children were often subjected to sexual abuse that continued until their deaths from disease, malnutrition, or violence. War widows were particularly vulnerable to sexual violence as they often had no male relatives to protect them, and possessed property that made them attractive targets for men who used sexual assault as a means of claiming their resources. These women faced impossible choices between submitting to abuse and facing starvation or homelessness. The sexual humiliation of enemies was a common practice that involved forcing captured opponents to engage in degrading sexual acts as a form of psychological warfare. These practices were designed to break the spirit of resistance and demonstrate complete dominance over defeated populations. Torture methods often included sexual elements that were designed to cause maximum psychological trauma, as well as physical pain. These techniques recognized the intimate connection between sexuality and personal identity, using sexual violence as a way to destroy people's sense of self and dignity. The disposal of bodies after sexual violence was often careless and public, with victims being left exposed as warnings to others or as expressions of contempt for their humanity. These displays of sexual violence served as community spectacles that normalized extreme brutality. Sexual violence against the clergy was sometimes motivated by anti-clerical sentiment and represented attacks on religious authority as much as individual victims. These assaults often involved particular brutality and humiliation designed to undermine the social status and spiritual authority of religious figures. The sexual attitudes and practices that developed during the medieval period had lasting effects that extended far beyond the Middle Ages, creating patterns of sexual dysfunction, gender inequality, and social pathology that continued to influence European society for centuries. The normalization of sexual violence during the medieval period established cultural patterns that persisted well into the modern era, with attitudes toward rape, domestic abuse, and sexual coercion that treated these behaviors as normal expressions of male privilege rather than serious crimes that deserved punishment. The commodification of human sexuality that characterized medieval marriage and prostitution systems created economic structures that continue to treat women and children as property rather than individuals with their own rights and dignity. These systems evolved but never completely disappeared from European social organization. The religious attitudes toward sexuality that developed during the Middle Ages continued to influence Christian teaching for centuries, creating traditions of sexual shame, guilt, and dysfunction that affected millions of people's ability to develop healthy intimate relationships and experience sexual satisfaction within marriage. The medical ignorance about sexuality and reproduction that characterized medieval medicine had lasting consequences for women's health and reproductive rights, establishing patterns of male medical authority over female bodies that persisted well into the 20th century and continue to influence healthcare delivery today. The legal frameworks that governed medieval marriage and sexuality created precedents for gender inequality that influenced law and social policy for hundreds of years, with women's legal status remaining subordinate to male authority in ways that reflected medieval attitudes about female capacity and social role. The social acceptance of child sexual abuse that characterized medieval society established cultural patterns that made it difficult for later generations to recognize and address the sexual exploitation of minors, with traditional authority structures protecting abusers rather than victims for centuries after the Middle Ages ended. The economic systems that profited from sexual exploitation during the medieval period evolved into modern forms of human trafficking and sexual commerce that continue to operate according to many of the same principles that governed medieval prostitution and sexual slavery. The intersection of sexuality and violence that characterized medieval culture created literary, artistic, and cultural traditions that celebrated sexual brutality and normalized extreme behaviors in ways that continue to influence popular entertainment and social attitudes towards sexual violence. The religious and medical institutions that developed during the medieval period to control and regulate human sexuality established patterns of institutional authority over intimate behavior that persisted for centuries and continue to influence debates about sexual freedom and reproductive rights. The shame and secrecy that surrounded sexuality during the medieval period created cultural traditions of sexual silence and ignorance that made it difficult for people to seek help for sexual problems, discuss intimate issues openly, or develop healthy attitudes toward their own bodies and desires. The technological and social innovations that emerged during the medieval period to facilitate sexual exploitation established precedents for using new technologies and social arrangements to enable sexual abuse and trafficking that continue to challenge modern efforts to protect vulnerable people from sexual exploitation. Medieval sexual practices also created long-lasting psychological patterns that influenced how entire cultures thought about pleasure, desire, and intimate relationships. The idea that sexual pleasure was inherently sinful or dangerous became so deeply embedded in European culture that it took centuries for people to develop healthier attitudes toward their own sexuality and that of others. The economic dependence of women that was enforced through medieval marriage laws created financial incentives for sexual exploitation that persisted long after the specific legal structures had changed. Women continued to be economically vulnerable to sexual coercion because they had limited independent income opportunities and social support systems. The medical establishment's ignorance about female sexuality during the medieval period created a legacy of inadequate healthcare for women that included everything from dangerous childbirth practices to complete misunderstanding of female reproductive anatomy. These medical deficiencies had multi-generational effects as incorrect information was passed down through families and medical training programs. The Church's emphasis on sexual guilt and shame created psychological frameworks for understanding sexuality that emphasized sin and punishment rather than health and happiness. These religious attitudes became so deeply embedded in European culture that they influenced secular approaches to sexuality long after formal religious authority had declined. The medieval period's normalization of extreme age gaps in sexual relationships established cultural patterns that made it difficult for later societies to recognize and address the sexual exploitation of young people. The idea that very young people could consent to sexual relationships with much older adults persisted in law and custom for centuries. The international networks that developed during the medieval period to facilitate sexual trafficking created precedents for modern criminal organizations that continue to exploit vulnerable people across national boundaries. These medieval trafficking networks established routes, methods, and social connections that evolved but never completely disappeared. The medieval period's emphasis on sexual hierarchy and dominance created cultural patterns that associated sexual activity with power relationships rather than mutual affection or pleasure.
These patterns influenced everything from marriage customs to workplace relationships and continued to shape social interactions between men and women for generations. The secrecy that surrounded sexual abuse during the medieval period established cultural norms that prioritized institutional reputation over individual safety. These patterns of covering up sexual crimes to protect powerful people or important institutions became deeply embedded in European culture and continued to influence responses to sexual abuse well into the modern era.
The medieval period's integration of sexual exploitation into economic and political systems created structural incentives for sexual abuse that persisted even when specific laws or customs changed. The fundamental economic and social relationships that enabled sexual exploitation during the medieval period continued to operate in modified forms for centuries afterward. The cultural acceptance of sexual violence during the medieval period created artistic and literary traditions that celebrated or romanticized sexual brutality. These cultural products continued to influence popular attitudes toward sexuality and violence, creating ongoing cycles where sexual violence was normalized through cultural representation. And so we reach the end of our journey through the sexual wasteland of medieval Europe, a time when humanity seemed determined to make every aspect of intimate life as unpleasant, dangerous, and dysfunctional as possible, from the child brides sold like livestock to the diseased brothels that served as community centers, from the religious hypocrites who preached celibacy while practicing exploitation, to the medical practitioners who tortured people in the name of sexual health. Medieval sexuality represents perhaps the darkest chapter in the long history of human intimate relationships. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this historical examination is not the cruelty, ignorance, or dysfunction that characterize medieval sexual practices, but rather how many of these patterns continue to influence human behavior long after the Middle Ages had ended. The attitudes toward women as property, the acceptance of sexual violence as normal male behavior, the shame and secrecy surrounding natural human desires, and the use of religious and medical authority to control intimate behavior, all persisted in various forms well into the modern era. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can take some comfort in the knowledge that for all the problems facing contemporary society, we have at least moved beyond the spectacular sexual dysfunction that characterized life in the Dark Ages. Modern people may struggle with intimacy, relationships, and sexual satisfaction, but at least we're not mixing unicorn horn with virgin's urine and calling it medicine, arranging marriages between 12-year-old girls and 50-year-old men, or burning people alive for having unconventional sexual desires. The human capacity for making sexuality complicated, dangerous, and unpleasant seems to be limitless, but the medieval period represents perhaps the ultimate expression of this unfortunate tendency. In a time when survival itself was uncertain, when disease and violence were constant threats, and when religious and social authorities seemed determined to eliminate any possibility of human pleasure or happiness, sexual relationships became another source of suffering, rather than comfort. But we haven't finished exploring the depths of medieval sexual depravity just yet. There are still darker corners to illuminate, more disturbing practices to examine, and additional ways that our ancestors managed to make sexuality even more horrifying than we've already discovered. The obsession with female virginity in medieval Europe created an entire economy built around the buying and selling of first sexual experiences, with complex systems for verifying, preserving, and commodifying what was considered the most valuable aspect of a woman's body. Professional virgin inspectors were employed by wealthy families to examine potential brides before marriage negotiations were finalized. These examinations were conducted by midwives or female physicians who claimed to be able to determine virginity through physical inspection, though their methods were based on completely incorrect anatomical assumptions and often caused physical damage to the women being examined. The market value of virginity varied significantly based on social class, age, and physical appearance, with detailed pricing structures that treated human innocence as a commodity to be appraised and traded. Young noble girls commanded the highest prices, while peasant women were considered barely worth the cost of examination. Artificial virginity restoration was a thriving black market business, with practitioners claiming to be able to restore the physical signs of virginity through various surgical procedures, herbal treatments, and mechanical devices. These operations were extremely dangerous and often resulted in serious infections, permanent disability, or death. But the social and economic pressure to appear virginal was so intense that many women risked their lives for these procedures. The sale of false virginity involved elaborate deception schemes where experienced prostitutes would pose as innocent young women, using various techniques to simulate the physical signs of first sexual experience. These fraudulent transactions often involved multiple participants and complex staging that required significant planning and investment. Virginity auctions were held in some medieval cities, where young women would be sold to the highest bidder for their first sexual experience. These events were often disguised as marriage markets or servant auctions, but they were essentially public sales of sexual access to children and teenagers who had no choice in the matter. The preservation of virginity involved extreme measures including physical restraints, constant supervision, and sometimes surgical modification of female anatomy to prevent any possibility of sexual activity. Girls from wealthy families might be kept in virtual imprisonment to ensure their market value remained intact until they could be sold in marriage. Religious institutions sometimes participated in the virginity trade by accepting monetary donations in exchange for providing virgin brides from their communities of young women who had taken religious vows. These arrangements violated both religious law and human decency, but they provided significant income for financially struggling monasteries and convents. The verification of virginity loss after marriage often involved public display of blood-stained bedding, physical examination by community elders, and sometimes even witnessing of the actual sexual act to ensure that the bride had indeed been a virgin and that the marriage had been properly consummated. International trading in virgins involved networks of merchants who specialized in transporting young women across national boundaries for sale to wealthy buyers in foreign markets. These trafficking operations often targeted poor families who were desperate enough to sell their daughters for minimal compensation. The social consequences of lost virginity outside marriage were so severe that many women who had been sexually assaulted would attempt to conceal their experiences through various means, including self-mutilation, suicide, or fleeing their communities entirely to avoid the social and economic destruction that would result from the loss of their sexual market value. Medical beliefs about virginity were so scientifically wrong that physicians regularly performed procedures and prescribed treatments based on completely false anatomical assumptions. These medical interventions often caused more damage than they prevented, and created additional suffering for women who were already victims of social and sexual exploitation. Medieval medical practice in matters of sexuality was so barbaric and ignorant that it's difficult to distinguish between legitimate medical treatment and deliberate torture, with physicians inflicting horrific suffering on patients while claiming to provide healing and care. Genital surgery was performed without anesthesia, using crude instruments that were often infected from previous use on other patients. These operations included everything from removing supposed excess tissue to attempting to enlarge or reduce various body parts based on medical theories that had no basis in reality. Bloodletting from intimate areas was prescribed for various sexual ailments, with physicians using leeches, knives, and other instruments to drain blood from genitals in the belief that this would cure everything from infertility to excessive sexual desire. These procedures often resulted in severe infections, permanent damage, and sometimes death. Cauterization of sexual organs was used to treat various conditions, with physicians applying red-hot metal instruments to intimate areas without any pain relief or proper aftercare. The screams of patients undergoing these procedures could be heard throughout entire neighborhoods, but the treatments continued because they were considered medically necessary. Chemical burns were deliberately inflicted on patients through the application of various acids, alkalis, and other caustic substances to sexual organs. These treatments were prescribed for conditions ranging from venereal diseases to supposed moral corruption, and they often caused permanent disfigurement and disability. Internal procedures involved inserting various objects and substances into body cavities, including heated metal instruments, toxic chemicals, and sharp objects that were supposed to cure internal ailments. These interventions often caused perforations, infections, and internal bleeding that were more dangerous than the original conditions. Trepanation for sexual problems involved drilling holes in patients' skulls to release supposed evil humors that were causing sexual dysfunction. This procedure was performed with crude tools and no understanding of brain anatomy, resulting in high mortality rates and severe neurological damage for survivors. Amputation of sexual organs was prescribed for various moral and medical conditions, with physicians removing parts of patients' bodies based on religious beliefs about the sinful nature of sexual pleasure. These operations were performed without proper surgical techniques or post-operative care, leading to high rates of infection and death. Poisoning treatments involved administering toxic substances to patients in the belief that these chemicals would cure sexual ailments. Mercury, arsenic, and various plant toxins were commonly prescribed, often in doses that were lethal or caused permanent organ damage. Starvation therapy was used to treat excessive sexual desire, with physicians prescribing prolonged fasting that was supposed to reduce sexual appetite by weakening the body. These treatments often resulted in malnutrition, organ failure, and death, but they were considered preferable to allowing patients to experience normal sexual feelings. Exposure treatments involved subjecting patients to extreme temperatures, with physicians believing that freezing or overheating the body would cure various sexual conditions. Patients were sometimes buried in snow, immersed in boiling water, or exposed to extreme heat for extended periods, often resulting in severe tissue damage or death. Psychological torture was disguised as medical treatment for sexual problems, with physicians using techniques designed to break patients' will and eliminate their sexual desires through systematic humiliation, fear, and mental anguish. These treatments often caused permanent psychological damage that was worse than any physical ailment. The highest levels of the medieval church were riddled with sexual scandals that demonstrated the complete hypocrisy of an institution that claimed moral authority over human sexuality while engaging in the most extreme forms of sexual exploitation and depravity. Papal mistresses were an open secret in medieval Rome, with popes maintaining elaborate households of women who served their sexual needs while officially promoting celibacy and sexual restraint. These relationships often resulted in children who were given important church positions despite their illegitimate birth. Cardinal brothels operated throughout medieval Europe with the knowledge and often financial support of high church officials who used these establishments for their own pleasure, while publicly condemning commercial sex. These institutions were often located near major cathedrals and religious centers, creating grotesque juxtapositions of sacred and profane activities. Ecclesiastical orgies were regular features of church celebrations and conferences, with religious gatherings often degenerating into massive sexual festivals that involved clergy at all levels of the hierarchy. These events were carefully concealed from the general public but were well known among church insiders. The sale of sexual indulgences allowed wealthy individuals to purchase permission for various sexual sins, creating a system where the church profited directly from sexual transgression while maintaining the pretense of moral authority. These indulgences were often sold for specific sexual acts, with detailed price lists for different types of sinful behavior. Nunnery prostitution was widespread throughout medieval Europe, with convents often serving as disguised brothels where nuns provided sexual services to male visitors under the cover of religious devotion. These arrangements were often organized by male clergy who profited from the commercial exploitation of women who had taken vows of chastity. Episcopal harems were maintained by bishops and other high church officials who kept multiple women for their sexual pleasure, while preaching about the virtues of celibacy and moral restraint. These arrangements often involved elaborate deception and cover-up schemes to maintain the appearance of religious propriety. Confessional seduction became a systematic practice among medieval clergy who used the privacy and authority of confession to sexually exploit parishioners. The sacrament of confession became a hunting ground for predatory priests who identified vulnerable individuals and used religious manipulation to coerce sexual compliance. Monastery breeding programs involved the systematic sexual exploitation of women, who were brought to religious institutions supposedly for spiritual guidance but were actually used to produce children for the clergy. These children were often raised within the religious community and given positions of authority despite their illegitimate birth. Papal bulls on sexuality were often written by church officials who were themselves engaging in the behaviors they officially condemned, creating legal and theological documents that bore no relationship to the actual sexual practices of their authors. The hypocrisy was so blatant that it became a source of popular ridicule and anti-clericalism. Religious relic fraud involved the creation and sale of supposed sacred objects that were actually related to the sexual activities of church officials. Body parts, clothing, and other items connected to sexual encounters were sometimes presented as holy relics and sold to unsuspecting believers. Ecclesiastical marriage mills operated in some regions where church officials would perform multiple marriage ceremonies in a single day, often without proper documentation or verification of the participants' eligibility. These operations were motivated by financial profit rather than religious devotion, and often resulted in bigamous or otherwise invalid marriages. The intersection of sexual pleasure and medical treatment in medieval Europe created a horrifying landscape of suffering, where physicians inflicted additional pain on patients who were already suffering from various sexual ailments and diseases. Syphilis treatment involved subjecting patients to mercury poisoning that was often more debilitating than the original disease. Patients were placed in sealed chambers filled with mercury vapor, resulting in severe neurological damage, tooth loss, and often death from metal poisoning, rather than the sexually transmitted infection. Gonorrhea remedies included inserting various objects and substances into the urethra, including heated metal rods, caustic chemicals, and sharp instruments that were supposed to clear infections, but usually caused additional damage and spread bacteria deeper into the urinary system. Herpes treatments involved burning infected areas with red-hot metal implements, applying acids and other caustic substances, and sometimes amputating affected body parts. These procedures were performed without anesthesia and often resulted in severe scarring, infection, and permanent disability. Fertility enhancement procedures included surgical modification of reproductive organs, insertion of various substances and objects into body cavities, and the administration of toxic chemicals that were supposed to increase conception rates but often caused sterility or death. Impotence cures ranged from bloodletting and organ removal to the application of electric eels and other painful stimuli to male genitalia. These treatments were based on completely incorrect theories about sexual function and usually made the original problems worse while causing additional suffering. Hysteria treatments for women involved procedures that were essentially sexual assault disguised as medical intervention. Female patients were subjected to various forms of physical stimulation and manipulation that physicians claimed were necessary for treating supposed mental and physical ailments related to female sexuality. Contraception methods included the insertion of dangerous substances and objects into the female reproductive system, often resulting in infections, internal injuries, and death. These primitive birth control methods were more likely to kill women than prevent pregnancy. Menstrual regulation involved bloodletting, purging, and the administration of toxic herbs and chemicals that were supposed to normalize female reproductive cycles but often caused severe illness and permanent reproductive damage. Sexual addiction treatments included physical restraints, surgical modification of sexual organs, and various forms of torture that were supposed to eliminate sexual desire, but usually resulted in psychological trauma and physical disability. Masturbation prevention devices were mechanical restraints and punishment systems designed to prevent self-stimulation through pain and physical restriction. These devices often caused severe injuries and infections while creating additional psychological problems for their victims. Venereal disease prevention included various forms of genital mutilation and modification that were supposed to prevent infection, but actually made transmission more likely while causing permanent damage to sexual function and appearance. The sexual exploitation of children in medieval Europe was so systematic and widespread that it constituted an entire industry built around the commodification of young people's bodies and innocence, with social and legal systems that facilitated rather than prevented this abuse. Child marriage markets operated in major cities where very young girls and boys were sold to adult buyers for immediate sexual use. These markets were often disguised as servant auctions or apprenticeship arrangements, but they were actually sophisticated child trafficking operations that supplied victims to wealthy predators. Apprenticeship sexual abuse was built into the economic system that governed skilled trades and crafts, with young people routinely subjected to sexual exploitation by their masters as part of their supposed education. This abuse was considered normal and acceptable, with no legal recourse available to victims. Religious child exploitation occurred in monasteries, convents, and other church institutions where young people were sexually abused by clergy and religious authorities who used their spiritual power to coerce compliance. These institutions often served as recruitment centers for organized sexual exploitation networks. Noble household abuse involved the systematic sexual exploitation of servant children and pages who worked in aristocratic households. These young people were completely vulnerable to sexual predation from their employers and had no legal protection or means of escape from abusive situations. International child trafficking networks operated across national boundaries, transporting young victims from poor regions to wealthy markets where they could be sold for sexual purposes. These operations were often run by legitimate merchants who used their trade connections to facilitate human trafficking. Educational sexual abuse occurred in schools and tutoring arrangements where children were sexually exploited by their teachers and educational supervisors. The lack of oversight and accountability in medieval education created ideal conditions for systematic abuse of vulnerable students. Street child exploitation involved the sexual abuse of orphans and homeless children who had no family protection or social support. These children were often forced into prostitution or sexual slavery as a means of survival, with no alternatives available to them. Royal court abuse involved the sexual exploitation of young courtiers and attendants by nobles and royalty, who used their political power to secure access to child victims. These abuses were often covered up to protect the reputation of powerful individuals and institutions. Military sexual abuse occurred when armies would capture and sexually exploit children during military campaigns and occupations. Young people in conquered territories were particularly vulnerable to systematic sexual violence from occupying forces. Economic sexual exploitation involved forcing children into sexual labor as a means of paying family debts or generating income for impoverished households. Parents sometimes sold their children into sexual slavery as a survival strategy when facing starvation or economic ruin. Legal system failures meant that child sexual abuse was rarely prosecuted or punished, with laws that provided minimal protection for young victims and maximum protection for adult perpetrators. The legal system often treated child sexual abuse as a property crime against parents rather than a crime against the children themselves. Medieval societies developed an extensive arsenal of devices and techniques specifically designed to inflict sexual torture and punishment, creating a technology of intimate cruelty that was used for everything from judicial punishment to private revenge. Genital torture devices included metal clamps, heated implements, and crushing mechanisms that were designed to cause maximum pain and damage to sexual organs. These instruments were often used in judicial proceedings as both punishment and interrogation tools. Chastity devices were metal and leather restraints that prevented sexual activity while causing constant discomfort and sometimes serious injury. These devices were often locked onto individuals for extended periods, resulting in infections, tissue damage, and psychological trauma. Penetration torture involved the forced insertion of various objects and substances into body cavities, often causing internal injuries, infections, and permanent damage. These procedures were sometimes disguised as medical treatments, but were actually forms of sexual violence. Suspension torture used various forms of hanging and restraint to put pressure on sexual organs and other sensitive areas of the body. Victims were often suspended in positions that maximized sexual humiliation and physical suffering. Burning implements were used to apply heat and fire to sexual organs and other sensitive areas, causing severe pain and permanent scarring. These devices ranged from simple heated metal tools to complex mechanisms designed to focus heat on specific body parts. Cutting instruments were designed to inflict precise damage to sexual organs and surrounding tissue, often causing permanent disability and disfigurement. These tools were sometimes used for judicial punishment and sometimes for private revenge or intimidation. Chemical torture involved the application of various acids, alkalis, and other caustic substances to sexual organs and other sensitive areas. These chemicals often caused permanent damage and were sometimes used as a form of slow execution. Animal torture involved using various creatures to inflict sexual violence and humiliation on victims. This practice combined sexual abuse with animal cruelty and was often used as a form of public entertainment as well as punishment. Psychological torture techniques were designed to break victims' will and self-respect through sexual humiliation and degradation. These methods often caused permanent mental damage that was more severe than physical injuries. Group torture involved subjecting victims to sexual violence by multiple perpetrators simultaneously, often in public settings designed to maximize humiliation and social destruction. These events were sometimes organized as community entertainment or political demonstration. Prolonged torture sessions could last for days or weeks, with victims subjected to continuous sexual violence and abuse that was designed to destroy their physical and mental health completely. These extended torture sessions were often fatal, but death was considered secondary to the infliction of maximum suffering. The medieval approach to reproduction and childbirth created a nightmare landscape of suffering, where women faced deadly risks, not just from pregnancy and delivery, but from the supposed medical care they received during these vulnerable times. Forced breeding programs operated in some communities where women were treated as livestock, with their reproductive cycles monitored and controlled to maximize the production of children for economic or political purposes. These programs often involved multiple men being assigned to impregnate individual women to ensure conception. Birthing torture involved subjecting women in labor to additional pain and suffering through various procedures that were supposed to aid delivery but actually made the process more dangerous and agonizing. These interventions were often motivated by moral beliefs about women's need to suffer during childbirth. Infanticide practices were widespread when children were born with disabilities, were the wrong gender, or represented economic burdens that families couldn't support. These killings were often disguised as accidents or natural deaths, but they represented systematic elimination of unwanted children. Caesarean section procedures were performed on living women without anesthesia or proper surgical techniques, often resulting in the death of both mother and child. These operations were sometimes performed by non-medical personnel using crude implements in desperate attempts to save babies from dying mothers. Postpartum punishment involved subjecting women to various forms of abuse and neglect after giving birth based on beliefs that women needed to be purified or punished for the sexual activity that had led to pregnancy. These practices often resulted in infections and deaths that could have been prevented with proper care. Contraception enforcement involved forcing women to use dangerous birth control methods that often caused serious health problems or death. These methods were sometimes imposed by husbands or communities that wanted to control women's reproductive capacity. Pregnancy testing involved dangerous and invasive procedures that were supposed to determine whether women were pregnant but often caused miscarriages or other complications. These tests were based on completely incorrect medical theories and usually caused more harm than information. Fertility punishment was imposed on women who failed to conceive or carry pregnancies to term, with various forms of abuse and social ostracism that were supposed to encourage reproductive success but actually made pregnancy less likely. Multiple pregnancy complications were made worse by medical interventions that were based on incorrect understanding of how multiple births occurred and what dangers they presented. Women carrying twins or triplets often received treatments that increased rather than decreased their risks. Prenatal torture involved subjecting pregnant women to various forms of abuse that were supposed to influence the development of their babies but usually caused miscarriages or birth defects. These practices were often motivated by superstitious beliefs about how maternal experiences affected fetal development. Birth defect blame was systematically placed on mothers who were accused of causing their children's disabilities through moral failings or inappropriate behavior during pregnancy. This blame was often used to justify abandoning or killing disabled infants while punishing their mothers. As we reach the deepest, darkest corners of medieval sexual practice, we encounter behaviors so extreme and depraved that they challenge our understanding of human capacity for cruelty and self-destruction, representing the absolute nadir of human sexual experience. Sexual cannibalism occurred during times of extreme social breakdown, when the boundaries between sexuality and violence completely disappeared, and people engaged in acts that combined sexual gratification with literal consumption of human flesh. These practices were sometimes ritualized and sometimes spontaneous, but they always represented complete moral and social collapse. Necrophilic communities formed around shared practices of sexual contact with the dead, creating subcultures that treated corpses as sexual partners and developed elaborate rituals and traditions around death and sexuality. These communities were often hidden from mainstream society, but operated with surprising organization and persistence. Extreme body modification for sexual purposes involved procedures that went far beyond anything that might be considered medically or aesthetically motivated, including amputation, insertion of objects under the skin, and surgical alteration of basic human anatomy in pursuit of enhanced or altered sexual experience. Sexual human sacrifice combined religious ritual with sexual violence, creating ceremonies where people were killed as part of sexual activities that were believed to have magical or spiritual significance. These practices were often hidden within seemingly legitimate religious activities, but represented complete perversion of spiritual beliefs. Genetic manipulation attempts involved trying to influence human reproduction through various forms of selective breeding, inbreeding, and crossbreeding that were motivated by sexual fetishes rather than any practical breeding goals. These experiments often resulted in severe genetic abnormalities and suffering for the children produced. Sexual slavery communities operated as complete societies built around the systematic exploitation of captive populations who were bred, trained, and used exclusively for sexual purposes. These communities sometimes lasted for generations, creating hereditary classes of sexual slaves who knew no other existence. Extreme pain cultivation involved developing tolerance for increasingly severe sexual torture and violence, with individuals and communities that competed to endure and inflict greater levels of suffering as a form of sexual gratification. These practices often resulted in permanent disability and death. Sexual warfare tactics involved using sexuality as a weapon of mass destruction against enemy populations, including systematic rape campaigns, sexual torture of prisoners, and the deliberate spread of sexually transmitted diseases as biological warfare. Ritualized sexual murder combined killing with sexual gratification in elaborate ceremonies that were sometimes individual and sometimes community activities. These practices often involved prolonged torture and were sometimes connected to religious or magical beliefs about death and sexuality. Child sacrifice for sexual purposes involved killing children as part of sexual rituals that were believed to enhance adult sexual experience or provide magical benefits to participants. These practices represented the ultimate perversion of both sexuality and parental instincts. Mass sexual destruction events occurred during social upheavals when entire communities would engage in collective sexual violence that destroyed social bonds and family structures, leaving psychological and social devastation that lasted for generations. And so we reach the absolute bottom of human sexual depravity, the point where sexuality becomes indistinguishable from the most extreme forms of violence and cruelty. The medieval period represents not just a dark age for human sexual expression, but perhaps the darkest possible expression of what happens when human sexuality is completely divorced from love, respect, and basic human decency. The practices we've explored tonight represent more than just historical curiosities or examples of how different our ancestors were from us. They represent warnings about what human sexuality can become when it's combined with ignorance, cruelty, and the complete absence of empathy or moral restraint. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can find some comfort in the knowledge that we have moved beyond these extremes of sexual dysfunction and cruelty. Modern society may have its problems with sexuality and relationships, but we have at least evolved beyond treating human beings as sexual commodities to be bought, sold, tortured, and discarded. The medieval period stands as a monument to human sexual dysfunction, a time when every aspect of intimate life was corrupted by ignorance, cruelty, and the systematic exploitation of the vulnerable by the powerful. It reminds us how far we have come, and how important it is to protect the sexual rights and dignity that we now take for granted. Sleep well, knowing that the sexual nightmare of medieval Europe has finally ended, and that tomorrow's world, whatever its problems, is infinitely more humane than the one we've explored tonight. The darkness of the past serves to highlight the light of the present, and the horrors of medieval sexuality make us appreciate the simple humanity of modern intimate relationships. Rest peacefully, secure in the knowledge that you live in a time when sexuality can be about love, pleasure, and mutual respect rather than commerce, violence, and exploitation. The medieval world of sexual horror is gone forever, leaving only its lessons and warnings for those wise enough to learn from history's darkest chapters. But even as we prepare to close this examination of medieval sexual dysfunction, there remain a few final corners of this historical nightmare that deserve illumination, practices so deeply embedded in the fabric of medieval society that they touched every aspect of human existence. The medieval period developed complex economic systems built entirely around sexual shame and the monetization of human dignity, creating markets where privacy, reputation, and basic human decency became commodities to be bought and sold. Blackmail networks operated throughout medieval Europe, with professional extortionists who specialized in discovering and exploiting sexual secrets for financial gain. These networks often had connections to religious institutions, government officials, and merchant guilds, creating sophisticated intelligence operations that turned sexual privacy into a luxury that only the wealthy could afford. Shame taxation was implemented by some communities where individuals were required to pay fees for various sexual behaviors, creating revenue streams that encouraged rather than discouraged sexual transgression. These taxes were often higher for poor people than rich people, making sexual behavior another area where wealth determined what was considered acceptable. Reputation insurance was available in some medieval cities, where individuals could purchase protection against sexual scandals through financial arrangements with powerful patrons who would defend their reputations in exchange for ongoing payments. These arrangements often required sexual favors as part of the insurance premium. Sexual bankruptcy occurred when individuals lost everything due to sexual scandals or allegations, with entire families being financially destroyed by accusations of sexual impropriety that might or might not have been true. The economic consequences of sexual shame were often more devastating than any legal punishment. Privacy markets developed where wealthy individuals could purchase silence and discretion from witnesses to their sexual activities, creating systems where sexual crimes and scandals could be covered up through financial payments rather than legal processes. Confession commerce involved the buying and selling of sexual sins through religious institutions that treated forgiveness as a financial transaction rather than a spiritual process.
The church developed detailed price lists for different types of sexual transgression, creating a commodified redemption system.
Virginity speculation involved financial investments in young women's sexual purity, with investors purchasing rights to future marriage payments based on the expected value of women's virginity in the marriage market. These investments treated human sexuality as a financial instrument to be traded and profited from. Sexual debt slavery occurred when individuals became financially obligated to provide sexual services to pay off various types of debt, creating systems where economic obligations were converted into sexual exploitation that could continue for years or even generations. Moral lending involved financial institutions that provided loans specifically for covering up sexual scandals, paying sexual debts, or purchasing sexual services, with these specialized lenders often charging extremely high interest rates and using sexual coercion to collect payments. Scandal arbitrage involved professional speculators who would invest in sexual controversies by purchasing information about sexual impropriety and then manipulating markets and social situations to maximize profits from the resulting chaos and destruction. Sexual inheritance systems treated sexual reputation and sexual obligations as property that could be passed down through families, creating hereditary sexual debts and sexual privileges that affected multiple generations and trapped families in cycles of sexual exploitation. Medieval societies developed increasingly sophisticated methods for controlling and monitoring human sexuality, creating technological and social systems that invaded every aspect of private life and intimate behavior. Mechanical chastity enforcement involved complex devices that were designed not just to prevent sexual activity, but to monitor and record any attempts at sexual behavior. These devices were often connected to alarm systems that would alert supervisors to any unauthorized sexual activity. Sexual surveillance networks operated in major cities and royal courts with professional observers who specialized in gathering information about the intimate lives of important individuals. These networks often included servants, religious figures, and even family members who were paid to report on sexual activities. Anatomical examination requirements forced individuals to submit to regular physical inspections that were designed to detect evidence of sexual activity. These examinations were often conducted by unqualified personnel and frequently caused physical and psychological trauma to the subjects. Sexual documentation systems required detailed record-keeping about intimate relationships, sexual activities, and reproductive outcomes. These records were often used for blackmail, social control, and legal proceedings that could destroy individuals and families. Behavioral modification techniques were developed to eliminate sexual desire and sexual behavior through various forms of conditioning, punishment, and psychological manipulation. These methods were often applied to children and young adults to prevent the development of normal sexual feelings. Communication interception involved monitoring and recording private conversations about sexual matters, with professional eavesdroppers who specialized in gathering intimate information that could be used for various forms of social and political control. Sexual curfew enforcement created time-based restrictions on when and where sexual activity could occur, with monitoring systems that tracked individuals' movements and activities to ensure compliance with sexual regulations. Identity verification systems were used to confirm the sexual history and sexual status of individuals, with complex documentation requirements that made it difficult for people to escape their sexual pasts or create new identities. Movement restriction technologies limited where sexually active individuals could travel or live, creating geographic boundaries that were enforced through various monitoring and punishment systems. Sexual quarantine systems isolated individuals who were considered sexually dangerous or sexually diseased, creating separate communities where sexual outcasts were confined and monitored. Reproductive monitoring involved tracking women's menstrual cycles, pregnancy status, and fertility indicators to control reproductive behavior and detect unauthorized sexual activity. Social credit systems assign numerical values to individuals based on their sexual behavior and sexual reputation, with these scores determining access to employment, housing, marriage opportunities, and social services. Medieval Europe was connected by vast international networks that facilitated the movement of people, information, and resources for sexual exploitation, on a scale that spanned continents and involved coordination between different cultures, religions, and political systems. Maritime sexual trafficking used the extensive shipping networks that connected European ports to transport victims across vast distances for sexual exploitation. Ship captains and merchants often participated in these operations, treating human cargo as just another valuable commodity to be transported and sold. Diplomatic sexual exchange involved the use of sexual services and sexual gifts as part of international relations, with ambassadors and diplomatic missions often including sexual entertainment and sexual favors as part of their official functions. Religious pilgrimage exploitation turned spiritual journeys into opportunities for sexual trafficking, with organized networks that identified and captured pilgrims for sexual slavery. The trust and vulnerability associated with religious travel made pilgrims particularly attractive targets. Military campaign trafficking followed armies as they moved across Europe, with organized groups that captured and enslaved civilian populations for sexual purposes. These operations were often more profitable than traditional military looting and became integral parts of medieval warfare. Trade route prostitution established permanent sexual service centers along major commercial routes, creating a network of brothels and sexual services that supported international commerce while facilitating the spread of diseases and sexual exploitation. Cultural exchange programs were sometimes disguised forms of sexual trafficking, with arrangements for educational or religious exchanges that were actually mechanisms for transporting victims to foreign markets where they could be exploited without detection. International marriage brokering involved complex networks that arranged marriages across national boundaries, often for the purpose of sexual trafficking disguised as legitimate matrimonial arrangements. Cross-border adoption schemes were used to obtain children for sexual exploitation, with false charitable organizations that claimed to be helping orphans, but were actually supplying victims to international sexual exploitation networks. Refugee exploitation targeted displaced populations who had fled wars, famines, or other disasters, taking advantage of their vulnerability and desperation to force them into sexual slavery. Financial transfer systems enabled the international movement of money related to sexual exploitation, with banking networks that facilitated payments for sexual services across national boundaries, while concealing the true nature of these transactions. Information networks shared details about sexual markets, victim availability, and law enforcement activities across international boundaries, creating intelligence systems that help sexual exploitation operations avoid detection and maximize profits. Legal arbitrage involved moving sexual exploitation activities to jurisdictions where laws were more permissive or enforcement was weaker, creating a race to the bottom in terms of legal protection for victims. As we reach the final depths of medieval sexual depravity, we encounter not just individual acts of cruelty, but the complete systemic destruction of human dignity itself, where entire societies organized themselves around the principle that some humans existed solely for the sexual gratification of others. Hereditary sexual slavery created entire bloodlines of people who were born into sexual servitude and had no legal or social recognition as human beings rather than sexual property. These systems persisted for generations, creating cultures where sexual slavery was considered natural and normal. Sexual breeding programs treated human reproduction as livestock management, with systematic efforts to produce children with specific physical characteristics that would make them more valuable in sexual markets. These programs often involved forcing related individuals to reproduce despite genetic consequences. Human sexual experimentation involved using people as test subjects for various sexual practices, medical procedures, and psychological techniques without any concern for their welfare or consent. These experiments were often disguised as medical research or religious activities. Sexual gladiator systems forced individuals to engage in sexual combat and competition for the entertainment of audiences, creating spectacles where sexual violence was presented as entertainment, and participants were often killed or permanently injured. Mass sexual destruction events were organized during periods of social upheaval, where entire populations would be subjected to systematic sexual violence as a form of warfare, social control, or entertainment. Sexual cult formation involved religious movements that were entirely organized around sexual exploitation, with theological justifications for practices that would otherwise be recognized as criminal. These cults often attracted followers by promising spiritual benefits through sexual submission. Human sexual sacrifice combined religious ritual with sexual violence, creating ceremonies where people were killed as part of sexual activities that were believed to have magical or spiritual significance. Sexual cannibalism practices involved consuming human flesh as part of sexual rituals, representing the ultimate fusion of sexuality with violence and the complete objectification of human beings. Systematic sexual torture was developed as a specialized field with professional practitioners who were trained in techniques for maximizing sexual suffering while keeping victims alive for extended periods. Sexual extermination programs targeted specific populations for elimination through sexual violence, using rape and sexual torture as methods of genocide against ethnic, religious, or social groups. Intergenerational sexual trauma created cycles of abuse where victims became perpetrators, passing sexual violence from one generation to the next, and creating communities where sexual abuse was the primary form of social interaction. Complete sexual dehumanization resulted in the creation of social categories, where certain groups of people were legally and socially defined as sexual objects rather than human beings, with no rights or protections under law or custom. And so we finally reach the absolute bottom of human sexual experience, the point where sexuality becomes completely divorced from humanity itself and transforms into something that can only be described as evil in its purest form. The medieval period represents not just a low point in human sexual behavior, but perhaps the ultimate expression of what happens when power combines with cruelty in the realm of human intimacy. The practices we've explored tonight serve as a reminder that human sexuality, when corrupted by power, ignorance, and cruelty, can become one of the most destructive forces in human experience. The medieval period shows us what happens when societies organize themselves around sexual exploitation rather than sexual dignity. As you finally drift off to sleep after this long journey through the darkest chapters of human sexual history, perhaps you can find comfort in knowing that these extreme forms of sexual dysfunction represent historical aberrations rather than inevitable aspects of human nature. The medieval world of systematic sexual cruelty is gone, replaced by modern societies that, whatever their flaws, generally recognize the basic principle that human sexuality should be based on consent, dignity, and mutual respect, rather than exploitation and violence. The horrors we've examined tonight serve as warnings rather than inevitabilities, reminders of how far human sexuality can fall when it's divorced from basic human decency, and how important it is to protect the sexual rights and freedoms that we now take for granted. Sleep peacefully knowing that the systematic sexual nightmare of medieval Europe represents a chapter of human history that has been closed forever, leaving behind only its lessons for those wise enough to learn from the past. The darkness serves to highlight the light, and the sexual horrors of the medieval period make us appreciate the simple humanity of modern intimate relationships. Rest well in a world where sexuality can be about love rather than commerce, pleasure rather than pain, and mutual respect rather than exploitation. The medieval world of sexual horror has passed into history, leaving us free to build better, more humane approaches to human intimacy and connection. Tomorrow's world, whatever its challenges, is infinitely more humane than the one we've explored tonight. The sexual nightmare of the Dark Ages is over, and humanity has learned to do better. Sweet dreams knowing that the worst of human sexual behavior is behind us, consigned to the history books where it belongs.